There is a layer in the Earth's crust, a thin, dark line in the rock, where the story of life almost ends. Below this line lies a world teeming with strange and spectacular creatures. Above it, there is almost nothing, an eerie silence preserved in stone. What kind of killer could so thoroughly silence a planet? And could it happen again? This is the Earth's greatest cold case. Now let's open the geological record and investigate the greatest murder mystery ever recorded. 252 million years ago, the world was a single supercontinent called Pangaea, and it was ruled by life forms that seem alien to us now. The age of dinosaurs was still millions of years in the future. Instead, the apex predators were creatures like the gorgonopsids, beasts the size of bears, with skulls armed with enormous saber-like canines. They were part of a group called the synapsids, the distant ancestors of all mammals, including us. The plains were dominated by herds of stocky, armored herbivores called paraiosaurs and legions of tusked, barrel-bodied descendants who foraged through vast fern prairies. The oceans, meanwhile, were a spectacle of diversity, home to the last of the great trilobites. Vast coral-like reefs built by completely different organisms, and a dizzying array of fish and marine reptiles. This was the Permian period, a world at its zenith, unaware it was standing on the edge of oblivion. When we, as investigators, analyze the evidence from the crime scene, the sheer scale of the event is staggering. This wasn't a localized disaster, it was a planetary execution. The fossil record shows that in what may have been the geological blink of an eye, over 90% of all species in the ocean vanished. On land, the devastation was just as severe, with more than 70% of vertebrate families wiped out. Entire ecosystems, built over tens of millions of years, were decapitated. Forests of giant glossopterous trees died off en masse, replaced by a world dominated by fungi for 1 million years. A fungal spike in the fossil record that serves as the planet's tombstone, evidence of a world covered in rot. Life on Earth came so close to being completely extinguished that it took more than 10 million years for biodiversity to recover to its previous levels. This event, known as the Permian-Triassic extinction, or more fittingly, the Great Dying, was the single greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life. It was a biological reset so profound that it cleared the slate for the next great dynasty to rise, the dinosaurs. To solve this case, we must go to the boundary layer itself, the geological equivalent of the chalk outline. In locations from the Karoo Basin in South Africa to the cliffs of Mesh in China, paleontologists can place a finger on this thin seam in the rock. Below it, the rock is full of the rich, diverse fossils of the late Permian. Directly above it, the fossils are gone, replaced by what are known as disaster taxa, a handful of hardy, opportunistic survivors, the planetary equivalent of weeds growing in a burned-out lot. This boundary tells us the murder weapon was swift, global, and indiscriminate. It poisoned the air, acidified the oceans, and scorched the land. The initial evidence suggests a killer that attacked the planet's life support systems from every conceivable angle. The question is no longer if a mass murder happened, but what force of nature could possibly be the culprit. With the scale of the crime established, the investigation now turns to identifying the perpetrator. In a case this old, direct evidence is scarce, buried under 252 million years of geological history. But the forensic clues left in the rock point to several prime suspects. For decades, a leading theory was an asteroid impact, similar to the one that killed the dinosaurs. Investigators searched for the telltale signs: a massive crater of the correct age, a global layer of iridium from the vaporized asteroid. But after years of searching, the evidence never materialized. The alibi for an impact is strong. It wasn't our killer. The true culprits were forces from within the Earth itself. When we assemble the lineup, we are left with 3 primary persons of interest: a geological arsonist, a microscopic poisoner, and the murder weapon they shared, a terminally toxic atmosphere. Our first suspect is a cataclysm of unimaginable scale, the Siberian Traps. This is not a single volcano, but a vast igneous province in modern-day Siberia, where for nearly 1 million years, the Earth's mantle bled fire onto the surface. When we analyze the crime scene, the timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. Geochronologists have dated these eruptions, and the main pulse of activity coincides exactly with the Permian-Triassic boundary. The sheer volume of the eruption is difficult to comprehend. Enough basalt lava flowed to cover an area larger than Western Europe in a layer kilometers thick. But the lava was just the delivery mechanism. The true killing agent was gas. The magma didn't just erupt onto the surface. It burned its way up through one of the world's largest coal basins and vast deposits of carbonate rock. This process, we believe, injected trillions of tons of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide directly into the atmosphere. The forensic proof lies in the chemistry of the rocks. When we put the carbon isotope data on the screen, we see a dramatic negative spike in the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12. This is the smoking gun. Carbon from volcanic eruptions and burning organic matter is isotopically light. This sharp global signature is the chemical fingerprint of that massive injection of greenhouse gases, a clear link between the Siberian Traps and the onset of the extinction. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Sulfur dioxide created intense acid rain that would have stripped vegetation from the land, poisoning soils and waterways. The immense flood of CO2 and methane triggered a runaway greenhouse effect, causing global temperatures to soar by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, perhaps more. The arsonist had set the world on fire. But was the fire enough to explain the near-total annihilation of life in the oceans? Some of the evidence suggested another culprit was involved, a more insidious killer operating on a microscopic scale. This brings us to suspect number 2, a single-celled organism called Methanosarcina. It is a microbe, an archaeon, that consumes organic carbon and excretes methane. When geneticists studied the genome of this microbe, they made a startling discovery. Through a process called horizontal gene transfer, Methanosarcina acquired a new set of genes that allowed it to become a hyper-efficient methane factory. The genetic clock dates this evolutionary innovation to right around the time of the Great Dying. The motive here is opportunity. The Siberian Traps eruptions weren't just releasing gas, they were also spewing huge quantities of nutrients into the environment, including the element nickel. For Methanosarcina, nickel is a critical cofactor for the enzymes that produce methane. The theory posits that the sudden influx of nickel into the world's oceans, delivered by volcanic ash, was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It allowed the newly evolved Methanosarcina to undergo a population explosion of planetary proportions, a microbial bloom that filled the seas. As they bloomed, they pumped colossal volumes of methane into the water and the atmosphere, far more than the volcanoes alone. This would have dramatically accelerated global warming and, crucially, would have deoxygenated the oceans. As the microbes consumed organic matter, they used up dissolved oxygen, turning vast swathes of the ocean anoxic. Stagnant, suffocating dead zones where only the poisoners themselves could thrive. The chemical evidence supports this. Global rock layers from this period show signs of widespread anoxia. The poisoner had found its moment. As we analyze the evidence, it becomes clear these two suspects were not working independently. This was not two separate attacks. It was a conspiracy. The Siberian Traps provided the initial stress on the system, the first wave of warming, the acid rain, and the nickel that armed the microbes. The Methanosarcina bloom was the second biological phase of the assault, tipping the planet's systems past the point of no return. Together, they created a feedback loop of death. Volcanic warming may have thawed frozen methane deposits on the seafloor, releasing even more greenhouse gas, which in turn accelerated the warming further. The world was caught in a lethal, self-perpetuating cycle, leading to a poisoned, overheated, and suffocating planet. The evidence has been presented and the suspects interrogated. We can now deliver a verdict in the case of the Great Dying. The final conclusion is that there was no single killer. The Permian-Triassic extinction was a death by 1,000 cuts, a planetary conspiracy where each element of the Earth's system was turned against itself in a horrifying cascade. The forensic data allows us to reconstruct this chain of events, a precise timeline of the greatest murder in history. The first domino to fall was the Siberian Traps.
Step 1.
These colossal eruptions were the inciting incident, delivering the initial massive shock to the global climate. The first wave of death began here, as runaway global warming and corrosive acid rain began to weaken the world's ecosystems. But this was only the first stage of the attack. The volcanoes also released the key that would unlock an even deadlier weapon. The flood of nickel into the oceans armed our second culprit, the methane-producing microbe Methanosarcina. This triggered the second and perhaps most critical phase of the extinction. Empowered by the heat and the nutrients, the microbial bloom was the tipping point. The planet's oceans, choked with these organisms, were rapidly stripped of oxygen. Marine life suffocated on a global scale as methane production went into overdrive, pushing the climate into a hyperthermal state from which it could not recover. The oceans were becoming toxic, acidic, and breathless. This led to the horrifying final phase. In the stagnant, anoxic deep ocean, another group of bacteria began to thrive, sulfate reducers. Their metabolic byproduct is hydrogen sulfide, a gas lethally toxic to most other forms of life. For millennia, this poison built up in the deep ocean until the waters became saturated. We believe that eventually this toxic gas began to erupt from the ocean into the atmosphere. Great plumes of hydrogen sulfide would have poisoned animals and plants on land directly. Perhaps even more devastatingly, it would have shredded the Earth's ozone layer, exposing the survivors to deadly levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. This was the final blow, a multi-pronged attack from land, sea, and sky that left nowhere to hide. It was a perfect killing machine, an interconnected sequence of geology, biology, and chemistry that culminated in a silent world. The Great Dying was the definitive reset of Earth's evolutionary clock. When the dust settled and the planet slowly began to recover over millions of years, the old rulers were gone. The empty ecological stage was now set for a new dynasty of life to emerge from the ashes, the archosaurs, and from them, the dinosaurs. The greatest extinction event the world has ever known, a crime of planetary proportions, was the very event that made the age of reptiles possible. The stone layers of the Permian-Triassic boundary are more than just a scar. They are a profound lesson written by the Earth itself. They teach us that our world is a single, complex machine where the air, the oceans, and life are inextricably linked. The Great Dying was not just an ending, but a violent resetting of the evolutionary clock, a silent testament to the terrifying power of a planet turning against itself.